All right, today we're going to tackle one of the most controversial parts of Canada's Constitution, Section 33, the Notwithstanding Clause. Is it this, dangerous loophole, or is it actually a democratic safeguard? We're going to dive into a paper that makes this really powerful case that it's not a bug in our system, but maybe one of its most important features.
So, the paper kicks things off with this really sharp quote from the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. And it just perfectly frames the debate at the heart of this whole thing. What's more fundamental in a democracy? Is it a written constitution, interpreted by judges, or is it the will of the people expressed through the folks they elect?
So yeah, who does get the final say? A panel of unelected judges who are appointed for life, or the politicians we can, hire and fire every few years? Well, the paper we're looking at today makes a really strong argument for the politicians, and let's see how it builds that case. Okay, so to really get into that debate, first we have to understand what Section 33 actually is, and, why it's been such a flashpoint for controversy ever since it was introduced way back in 1982. So, in simple terms, you can think of it like a constitutional override switch. It lets federal or provincial governments pass a law that operates notwithstanding, in spite of, certain fundamental freedoms and legal rights that are laid out in the Charter. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How does this override actually work, and what are its limits, because it does have them? Okay, here's the formal definition for you. So the key things to notice are that it's an explicit power given to legislatures, and, this is super important, it's not permanent. That 5-year term limit, the paper argues that's absolutely central to its whole democratic function.
The history here is actually pretty fascinating. The paper really emphasizes that this clause wasn't just some last-minute thing they threw in. Nope, it was a great political compromise. See, provincial leaders were really worried that a powerful new charter, interpreted by judges appointed by the feds, would just chip away at their power. So, Section 33? Well, that was their democratic safety valve.
And that brings us to this idea of a built-in democratic clock. Invoking the clause isn't a one-and-done deal, right? A government can't just flip the switch and walk away. Every 5 years, they have to face the music. They have to actively redeclare it, and that usually means having to defend that decision in an election.
It's also so important to know that this clause is not a blank check. The framers put a fence around the most fundamental parts of democracy itself. You can't use the clause to, say, cancel elections or get rid of the right to vote. And this really careful design is key to understanding the paper's whole argument. Okay, so this brings us to the very core of the paper's defense. This idea that Section 33, far from being anti-democratic, is actually a vital tool. A tool for making sure that our elected officials, not judges, are the ones who ultimately govern.
The author really frames the central conflict like this. You've got the judges on one side. Sure, they're brilliant legal minds, but they're unelected and they're not accountable to you and me. And on the other side, you have legislators who basically live in constant fear of the next election. So the paper asks a pretty simple question: who should have the final say?
And the author uses this really powerful phrase, a judicial aristocracy, to describe what the framers were so worried about. The fear was that if you give the final, unchallengeable power over rights to the courts, you're basically transferring sovereignty from the people to this tiny group of judges. Okay, now this is where the paper's argument gets really interesting, and maybe a little counterintuitive. It claims that the clause can actually be used to protect rights, and especially for minorities. So the logic in the paper goes something like this. Rights often conflict with each other, right? And a courtroom battle, well, that tends to produce a clear winner and a clear loser. The author argues that a legislature, because it can have public debates and deliberations, can find more nuanced compromises that are more sensitive to specific cultural situations. And the paper doesn't just say this, it provides specific examples to back it up. So in Saskatchewan, the argument is that the clause was used to protect the funding for Catholic schools, which is a minority right from a court ruling that was threatening it. And in Quebec, it's been used to shield laws that are aimed at preserving the province's really unique cultural and linguistic identity. Of course, the biggest counterargument you always hear is that a majority in a legislature will just use this power to trample all over the rights of minorities. But the author confronts this head-on, suggesting that maybe we shouldn't automatically assume that courts are always the better protectors. And to challenge that assumption, the paper actually points to the numbers. If you look at visible minority representation, it turns out that key legislatures are actually more diverse than the courts. The author uses this data to really question the whole idea that the judiciary is somehow inherently more in touch with minority perspectives. So if the courts aren't the ultimate protectors of our rights, then what is? And that brings us to the paper's conclusion about where the real check and balance in our system lies.
The paper's conclusion here is pretty blunt. The ultimate protection against a government going too far with the Notwithstanding Clause, it isn't a judge in a robe. It's something much, much more direct.
It all comes back to this number, 5. That 5-year sunset clause, it's not just some boring technical detail. The author argues it's the most powerful democratic review mechanism in the entire Constitution. Why? Because it forces a public debate.
So the crucial point is this. If a government uses the clause in a way that the public absolutely hates, they can be held accountable at the ballot box. And for the author, this is the most legitimate and the most powerful check there is. The power doesn't rest with 9 judges, it rests with millions of voters.
And that's really where the paper leaves us, forcing us to go back to that fundamental question. Where should we place our ultimate faith? In the judicial process or in the democratic one? The paper makes a really compelling case for democracy, arguing that the ballot box, not the courtroom, is the final guardian of our rights. But the question for us is, in this age of intense political division, is that a risk we're still willing to take?